Yes, welcome all. I see you are not interested in the beautiful weather today. You'd rather be here with me listening to my voice droning away now for the next, well, we'll see how far we'll take it. And then we, of course, have the performance of Trine to look forward to. Okay, doing research for this exhibition, I have come across a wide range of subjects regarding language, and hopefully some of them will interest you as well. Of course, as I mentioned, if you become bored or just don't understand why or what I talk about, feel free to just relax and close your eyes and just listen to the sound of the individual noises that are blowing out of my mouth. And just imagine that it's not me, it's just my mouth talking. I've called this talk Language in Time, as Steinar mentioned, and it is language and time are two of the most broad terms I know. So far-reaching that you could probably fit every other concept into one of these two. If you think about it, what else is there but language and time? I could probably have chosen a more narrow topic, but no, I refuse to narrow it down. Instead, I've tried to make another idea here. I will try to play some sounds in between talking. Some small excerpts of sound that I will spread out and play at some random points. These sounds are like a curated small playlist, like a side program of all the topics that I don't have time to talk about. So we'll see how that goes. So from time to time I will play some of these small sound bites, mostly examples of what I call extra linguistic use of language. And that is language used in unusual ways. And also points where language and music intersect. They are all in some way sources of inspiration for this exhibition, and they are mostly picked up from various sound archives and similar other people's recordings. But I wish to start with some of my own recordings, and I will play for you now first to warm up your ears a little bit. First, a small sound piece I made just sketched by using diphthongs from the International Phonetic Alphabet. And then there will be some more alphabets in various languages that I asked some friends of mine to read as fast as they can. So let's start with this and see if we...
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q.
Або вегде є ж заїкали мене опростив, вихаце чеше ще твердий знак і м'який знак і я.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, L, M, N, S.
Калемене О.
Kallade O.
P,
Р.
O, R, S, T, U, V, Z.
あいうえを書きくけこさしすせと立ちすてと何ぬねのはひふえほまみむめもらりるれろ。Stop.
Okay. So, my main subject today, as I mentioned, is the extra linguistic ways in which language is used. At its core, language is a form of collective memory mechanism, the medium used for storing and transmitting information. And this leads to a problem when languages change. It is impossible to avoid that languages change over time, losing this information, even to the point of becoming extinct and dead languages that later have to be decrypted to be understood at all. But what is lost? The information or just the medium of that information? These processes are highly complex. Regarding dying languages, for instance, the process is connected to cultures either mixing or being isolated from each other. A few years ago, I was traveling in northern Finland with a camera and a microphone, recording all the individual words of the Skoltsami language for an art in public spaces project at a museum. And during this trip, I learned a lot of how these processes work in practice. In the case of Skoltsami, the cause of why the language is at risk is fairly obvious. Because historically, the Skoltsami areas are split between Russia, Norway, and Finland, and the people were forced to move into a kind of permanent exile in the new areas of Finland after the Winter War in 1938. So, of course, their language became under immense pressure from the Finnish. That language has now almost taken over. People I met, they told me they don't speak Skoltsami at home anymore, between the generations of the family. The young are being taught Skolt in school, that is good, and the old are speaking amongst each other, sometimes at work or various gatherings. But when the link between generations is lost, it is a sure sign that the end is near for any language. But how come there are so many languages in the first place? In particular, all these indigenous ones. There are, for instance, not just one Sami language, but something like 9 different ones. Here, isolation plays a part. When a group is more or less broken off and isolated from other groups, over time, the language change makes these two languages, these two groups, differ to a point where they no longer can understand each other. Often this is more rapid than you'd think. Scientists have found that it is not a slow and steady process, but more like bursts of change that happens when a group is split out from another group. So even after 3 or 4 generations, it can start to become difficult to understand each other between the two groups. So that is why there are so many languages in remote areas of the world, but fewer where there is not so much space for groups to be isolated. Also, we are kind of running out of room to create new languages, it would seem. So the driving forces of change is found within language itself. This is also like a big topic, too many factors for me to go in detail, but in short, language change is a kind of evolutionary process. The users of a language keep inventing new expressions and connecting words and sounds in new ways, using metaphors and analogies. And at the same time, there are forces of economy within the use of sounds. Sounds that are difficult to pronounce after each other, for instance, will be changed to something easier, words melt together, and so on. So lots of different processes. So that's like the driving forces that are found within language and what makes this change happen. So another small sound break. Now you're so lucky you're going to hear first an Inuit imitating various animals, then some glossolalia that is speaking in tongues, and then finally some sleep talking.
Imitating one of the ducks. Imitating a walrus. Imitating a goose. Huh? 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 Imitating a white goose. Imitating a swan. Imitating a bear and a dog.
Stonde hande hockey tai geleleki tau, jinne mahande zinde de leki shute tai. Azundela ekitan de lehigno na hai, jinne do holeki si de bokos de lehikai. Yeret ho, lang de gitar hai, jule boku jule koto, azole hidinai.
Hamesala mariodo gozidi di himala koshi della masende mariondo. Vomiri sindel marienda la mahasidiana, vasela mavolo, lisela mahalienda la sonomodo, losala marienda di hishana mahai.
For you see, my children, you have walked in deep truth tonight.
The animal Daniel behavior and its schedule soon same cause you are apart, whether it's old and new, hard nights, some meteorist, caught anti-plantation, feminist, figurativist, expert delivery, land, frozen, food, little plastic sticks.
So, back to the forces of creation and destruction of language. These forces have caused multiple attempts throughout history to either control or stop this destruction. And I don't mean now as to stop languages from dying, but when people try to sort of freeze language or to stop the destructive forces in it that changes it, and at other times try to release the creative forces that are inherent in it. Sometimes a little bit of both. In poetry, for instance, we have the rhymes and rhythmical structures, with a number of different approaches to making a system for a spoken text. In ancient poetry, there is the concept of meter and the study of prosody. We are most used to poetry in our language based on stress, the power of syllables, making the rhythms. But in many classical languages, the meter is based on quantity, that is, the length of syllables. Hexameter is one famous example from the Greek and Latin, and these or similar systems are also common in Indian, in Sanskrit texts. So these various rules of ancient poetry is sometimes viewed as a powerful way to memorize texts. It can be seen as a mnemonic device made to imprint a text into memory for later spoken performance. So in a way, all rules of poetry were originally made to freeze and memorize this oral heritage. This also made it useful for religious purposes, like the old Rigvedic texts, for instance, in India. We will come back to those. Later on, with written text and literacy spreading, these different rules become more interesting as, in a way you can break the rules. So breaking the rules become the norm in a way. The rules become unnecessary ornaments, and sometimes the rules even make things harder to read and memorize. So things have changed until more modern times. Another important change comes with the invention of silent reading. When the monks start reading silently instead of aloud in the reading rooms, then things also changed. You have become, or you have spaces between words. In the early text you had no spaces, it was just a stream of sounds. So spaces between words are invented and they start appearing in texts. And at some point they replace the meter and the natural flow of sound that was in these spoken texts originally. So to talk a little bit more about India, I was having a residency in India last year, and I became familiar with these traditions of reciting the Vedic texts in the temples and in the ceremonies by the riverbed each evening. In short, the recital or chant, the way they do this, has 3 different pitches. And each syllable is then sung at a pitch determined by its length, as we talked about in the language. So the melodic structure grows out of the language itself. In addition, the words are repeated in various patterns to make it very repetitive and hypnotic, of course, originally to make it easier to remember. For thousands of years, this method made it possible that the texts were handed down word by word from generation to generation without changing one single syllable. So this tradition, in this tradition, the solution for storing information and memorizing text has now become the ritual itself, and also it has become very musical. It's also it's also used in Indian music. In a way, this oral transmission could even be said to be a more secure storage medium than any written record. After all, the Library of Alexandria can be burnt down. No matter how big the disaster, as long as there are humans left, they will transmit knowledge and language to the next generation orally. So, based on this, I've made this sort of conceptual composition work, structural metaphors of Western thought recited in the Vedic style. Is of course, I've taken another text, an English text, so I'm sort of forcing an English text into the Vedic meter, and that is, of course, in reality, completely impossible to do. So, but still, I've tried to do it, and it's also not meant to be performed in any way. It's more meant to be just read and seen like this. But we will try to perform it anyway after I finish talking. So we're doing a lot of these impossible things and now trying them anyway. So we'll see how it goes. Trine Hylander Friis will do her interpretation. So some more sound from the parallel sound program now. I thought I'd play two kind of children's games or language games, musical language games. First one from the Inuit, which is this throat singing with the two girls singing into their mouths, each other. They turn towards each other. And then a similar or like a greeting song from Burundi. The Czech composer Janacek always had a small notebook with him when he was walking around the streets of Prague. And in this book he could note down small pieces of musical notation, small snippets of melodies. And the interesting thing is that these were based on small pieces of spoken language that he heard around him in the streets or shops or wherever. He called these small pieces for napevki mluvi, or tunelets of speech. He was a collector, in a way, of thousands of these small speech melodies throughout his life. It filled several notebooks, and as far as we know, he did not use them in his compositions in any way. So it was more like a private research archive, or it's all a little bit mysterious. But it is a very strange thing to write down speech melodies as notes in a score. It certainly is not very realistic, because as you can hear when I speak, my notes or syllables are fluctuating wildly within each syllable. It's not just a steady auto-tuned robot voice. It's more all over the place. So it's quite impossible to transcribe speech as regular musical notation. You would need to invent your own notation to do that. So we may never know what Janacek expected to learn or achieve by collecting all his tunelets of speech. What I find interesting here is how you can train yourself to hear something as music. In this case, to hear language as music. What is the difference between hearing something as music and not hearing something as music? And what is the difference between hearing language as music and music as language? I'm going to play first a hunting language from Uganda, where they use this whistling. They translate language into whistling to be able to communicate while hunting. Also, we're going to hear some drum language, some flute language, and horn language from various parts of Africa.
Kunekadimbe Obikobike Nameo Sikikumbusa Aida igulu Atukike asikika kamilije kekina Atukike amugi agugwa babimba Neribia Akuai Obikikingwete Tebe Tebe Mugabe Mbungu Ngwe Ntale Ngawa Kubiba Asimba Njoka Ngeye Mbeba Mbungu Ngwe Ntale Njoka Mbeba Tebe Ngeye
Yovroni kwesege Eche krande aloto Yovroni kwesege Eche krande loloto
The philosopher Walter Benjamin describes in one of his thought figures, as he called them, from 1933, a children's game where a chain of unconnected words are to be made into a coherent story without changing their ordering. So the words are pretzel, feather, pause, lament, clowning. Children, says Benjamin, view words as a kind of cave systems with often unusual and surprising connections. He also compares this to religious texts that often have the same form. Finally, he gives an example of how a child connected these words. Time sweeps through nature like a pretzel. The feather paints the landscape, and if a pause ensues, it is filled with rain. No lament is heard, for there is no clowning around. Another similar example of, but this time from the world of grown-ups, is the French writer Raymond Roussel from the early 1900s. He explained just before his death how he had written his books and how his peculiar style of writing came about. It turned out to be a kind of wordplay with rules based on the homonymity between words. That is, words that either sound the same but means different things, or words that in other ways are very close in their sound patterns. Like air, or bear and bear, or beer, or so on. The French are, of course, famous for using a lot of wordplay like this, not to mention the whole field of psychoanalysis and all this. Roussel's writing is characterized by putting into writing elaborate imaginative constructions. That is what he usually writes about, often musical or kinetic instruments that could not possibly exist. As a starting point, he would often start with quotes from famous contemporary writers like Victor Hugo or Jules Verne, and then by methodically misunderstanding the sounds in the language, he would build these into new conceptual instruments, personalities and places, all described in very rich detail. In this way, he can also be seen to have given his machines and his texts a kind of authorless life, since it's not he as a writer, but the language itself that is the origin of the text. This is a good example of what I call extra-linguistic use of language, where the sound of the language becomes the basis for creative expression. Maybe earplay would be a better concept than wordplay, and this also connects to my previous points about languages dying. Because when a language dies, what is lost? In this case, a possible set of such wordplays or earplays is lost when a language dies. Each language seems to have a unique field of topological possibilities. Each language has a set of sound poetic connections that another language will never invent. So I think I'll turn now to in the end now to even more complex subject, that of metaphors. But before this, let's play a little more sounds. We have a very famous on Papua New Guinea, the island group. There is this this tradition of making songs and ceremonies, like funeral songs that are based on a bird and a bird song. So I will play the first an example of the funeral song, and then you'll hear the bird song, so you can hear a little bit of the similarities.
Oh!
So, I now wish to turn briefly to an even more complex subject, that of metaphors. Lakoff and Johnson, two American writers, a linguist and a philosopher, wrote their famous book, Metaphors We Live By. Yeah, I brought some of the books I'm talking about here, so you can have a look later. They wrote it in 1980 and more or less created a new branch of linguistic study called cognitive or conceptual metaphors. Their basic idea was that in everyday language is filled with metaphors that we may not always notice, like argument is war. We don't say this, but we say, I won that argument, or I attacked a weak point in the argument of my opponent or enemy. Or the first metaphor from this work is, a problem is a body of water. Also a little weird sentence, but if you think about it, it's about keeping your head above water, and I'm drowning in problems, or things like that. So these are the conceptual metaphors. This work is listing all the conceptual metaphors of this peculiar kind of linguistic study. Different languages often employ the same metaphors, and they often appear to be perceptually based. So there is still experience and perception, things outside of language at their core. Even if they, as a list of metaphors, seemingly are under control, then below them there is an ocean of problems connected to how we view things as similar in our perceptual experience. So it's not easy to make a full list of this. In short, the list I've used in my work is a system of these conceptual metaphors that some would even go as far as to say is a system of the way we all think. And I find it very interesting that this core system of our thought is something that is as unruly, something as destructive and creative as metaphors. Finally, as you can see in an art context as this, the metaphors are of course everywhere, and they are key to making an art object in a way. I don't mean that every artwork has to contain metaphors, but there is something very fundamentally metaphorical about thinking about artworks as objects, as if subject, to make the artwork stand out and come alive. One taps into a metaphorical movement, a kind of basic creative energy inherent in language. So let me end by leave you with a quote by Antonin Artaud from his book, The Theatre and Its Double. To make metaphysics out of a spoken language is to make the language express what it does not ordinarily express, to make use of it in a new, exceptional, and unaccustomed fashion, to reveal its possibilities for producing physical shock, to divide and distribute it actively in space, to deal with intonations in an absolutely concrete manner, restoring their power to shatter as well as really to manifest something. To turn against language and its basely utilitarian, one could say, alimentary sources, against its trapped beast origins, and finally to consider language as the form of incantation. And with this, I now will give the floor to Trine for her take on this work.